What if a multi-billion-dollar oil refinery, protected by layered radars, interceptor missiles, and fighter jets, could still be taken down by drones that cost less than a family car? At 1:47 a.m., long before dawn touched the edges of Europe, the darkness above northern Ukraine felt different, heavier, charged. Inside a concealed launch site hidden beneath an abandoned orchard, Ukrainian operators prepared a strike designed to travel more than 1,020 kilometers into Russian territory. If you're enjoying this kind of breakdown, consider subscribing, because tonight the first target wasn't the refinery at all. It was the system that was supposed to warn Russia it was coming. Their ultimate objective was the Korean refinery, a sprawling industrial giant that processed over 6.2% of Russia's national fuel output. On paper, it was the kind of facility you don't raid. You cripple it with cruise missiles, bombers, or weeks of sabotage, not with drones. But Ukraine wasn't looking for a symbolic hit. They wanted a measurable wound, something that would echo through supply lines, aviation hubs, and military logistics before the sun even climbed over the Baltic. The problem wasn't distance. The problem was visibility. Russia's early warning network, those radar nodes, and overlapping defensive belts, was built to spot high-altitude threats long before they reached a target like Kirishi. So Ukraine's planners built the mission around one brutal requirement. They needed an opening blow sharp enough to punch a temporary hole in that warning net before the main swarm ever left the ground. And at 1:52 a.m., that opening blow began. The first wave wasn't aimed at Kirishi's fuel tanks, cracking towers, or pressure lines. It went after something far less dramatic, but far more important, a modest early warning radar site known as Neville, sitting roughly 50 kilometers from the Belarusian border. It wasn't modern, it wasn't famous, it wasn't the kind of target Moscow expected anyone to waste resources on, which was exactly why it mattered. At 1:52 a.m., Ukrainian operators launched 14 UJ-22 drones, each weighing little more than a motorcycle, but carrying enough payload to blind a regional command sector if they hit the right points. The UJ-22s dropped low and leveled out, skimming forward at treetop height, around 80 meters, using terrain and the radar horizon as their camouflage. By the time Russian operators registered the first strange, low-altitude anomalies, the drones were already inside the perimeter. 3 slammed into the generator and support structures near the antenna grid. The blast wasn't the kind that flattens buildings. It didn't need to be. It only needed to break the chain. The radar feed flickered, stuttered, then died completely. Nearby, an S-300 crew reacted fast, launching expensive interceptor missiles to swat down a few stragglers spiraling overhead. Each intercept cost millions. The drones didn't, and for Ukraine, that wasn't just an economic imbalance. It was proof that the trap was working, because while Russia burned money trying to kill the leftovers, the real attack was already leaving the orchard. By 2 a.m., the night sky over Ukraine had quietly shifted. The small strike on Neville did exactly what planners needed. It forced Russian early warning crews into confusion, recalibrating, double-checking, arguing with their own screens. And inside that narrow window, the main operation came alive. The first FP-1 accelerated off its launch rail, climbing to speed before its wings locked stiff and carried it northeast. 15 seconds later, another followed, then another. Within 4 minutes, more than 30 FP-1s were airborne from just this single orchard site. But this wasn't one launch point, it was a network. Across central Ukraine, similar scenes unfolded at the same time. Inside barns, beside highway rest stops, on factory rooftops, even from a converted grain silo used as a midnight control hub. Each location looked improvised. Each was actually part of a synchronized machine. By 2:18 a.m., the total count in the air had climbed toward 350 drones. What looked chaotic from the outside was timed down to the minute. Different groups assigned different cruising speeds. Fast FP-1 strikers, slower support drones, and decoys, so they would all arrive inside Russia within the same tight attack window. One swarm, many directions, one moment of impact. Russia finally detected something unusual around 2:23 a.m. A radar post near Bryansk reported multiple low signature tracks, faint returns climbing steadily across the screen. At first, operators tried to explain it away as atmospheric clutter, false echoes, noise. Then the count kept rising, 10, 20, 30. When it hit 41 separate returns, hesitation snapped into protocol. Alerts went out, phones rang. The calm routine of night shift monitoring turned into a scramble. Within minutes, MiG-31 interceptors were launched, engines howling as they climbed into the dark, their Zaslon M radar sweeping at full power, and almost immediately they locked onto targets. But not the targets that mattered. They locked onto the higher, easier to see decoys, exactly what Ukraine had designed them to do. Every kilometer those fighters climbed was a kilometer they weren't hunting for the FP-1s hiding just 50 meters above the ground, sliding forward under the radar horizon like shadows. As the swarm pushed northeast, the landscape beneath them flattened, the air grew heavier, and the defenses grew denser. This was the line Ukraine had spent months preparing for, Russia's most fortified air defense belt guarding the approaches towards strategic infrastructure. By 4 a.m., the Kurishi strike package, once nearly 30 drones, had been reduced to 26, not because the plan was failing, but because the plan assumed losses. A swarm only needs enough survivors to reach the core. Now the formation shifted with mechanical precision. The Magan 5 decoys climbed higher, past 3,200 meters, broadcasting spoofed telemetry and carrying oversized radar reflectors to look bigger than they were. Below them, UJ-22 support drones leveled around 1,600 meters, built tough enough to survive near-miss shockwaves and keep flying through turbulence created by intercepts. And beneath all of it, the FP-1 strikers stayed low, quiet, fast, and almost invisible, threading the gap between terrain and radar. Then Russia's Cheese Grater radar caught a flicker. The flicker came from the 9S-19M2, nicknamed the Cheese Grater radar, part of an S-300 battalion positioned to guard the approaches into Russia's northwest. This wasn't some outdated screen in a shed. This was a system built for modern air war, frequency hopping over 100 times per second, designed to resist jamming and track threats through clutter. In Russian doctrine, once a radar like this acquired you, the sky became a math problem you didn't survive. But Ukraine's planners weren't trying to jam it. They were exploiting a flaw they'd learned months earlier. Every 10 seconds, the radar performed a recalibration routine. Brief, automatic, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. And during that routine, it went blind for half a second. Half a second doesn't sound like much until you're moving low and fast and you only need one gap. One Magan 5 decoy climbed deliberately, almost arrogantly, rising above 5,000 meters and broadcasting a clean, tempting signature. The radar bit. A missile launch followed. An expensive, violent commitment. But in the seconds before impact, the decoy did its real job. Its transmitter recorded the radar's reset rhythm, the exact heartbeat of that half-second blindness, and pushed the timing back to the swarm. Then the command went out. 25 drones dove at once. For half a second, the radar saw nothing, and when its beam returned, the sky was empty. The strikers had slipped beneath the horizon, hidden not by stealth, but by geometry itself. And at 6:19 a.m., they broke through the final defensive layer. Ahead, the darkness began to glow, not from sunrise, but from industry. At 6:19 a.m., the Kurishi refinery rose over the tree line like a lit city. Fuel tanks lined up in rows, cracking towers silhouetted against floodlights, pipe racks stretching for kilometers like metal veins carrying pressure and heat through the complex. For the drones, it wasn't just a target, it was a map of weak points. Distillation units, transfer lines, storage lids, control nodes, each one capable of triggering a larger failure if hit at the right moment. The swarm had reached its objective, and at 6:20 a.m., Kurishi began to break. The first detonation didn't just tear metal, it tore into the refinery's balance. An FP-1 slammed into the primary crude distillation unit, striking where decades of upgrades had layered new components over old Soviet-era frames. The blast generated a brutal overpressure that snapped weakened supports and buckled sections that had lived too long on maintenance patches and corrosion control. Inside the unit, crude wasn't just hot, it was superheated and pressurized, moving through lines that depended on stable flow and stable temperature to remain safe. When the impact ruptured those pipes, the contents flashed out into open air. In seconds, vapor formed, then ignited. Fire didn't spread like a campfire here. It moved like a wave, racing through pipe corridors, climbing ladders of scaffolding, licking across insulation, and finding every leaked hydrocarbon like it was laid out on purpose. Operators inside the complex had almost no time to react. This wasn't a single localized blaze. It was multiple ignition points forming at once, faster than manual valves could be isolated. Then came the second strike. Another FP-1 hit Tank 47, a floating roof storage tank holding tens of thousands of barrels. The seal area ignited instantly, turning the vapor pocket under the roof into a pressure chamber. The roof didn't lift, it launched. A massive steel lid tore free and flew across the yard, crashing down hard enough to punch through another structure and scatter burning debris into adjacent sectors. And that was when Kurishi stopped being a refinery fight and became a cascade. Automatic suppression systems tried to respond, but they were fighting with broken hands. The earliest blasts had severed critical lines, especially the main water trunk feeding Kirishi's sprinkler network. Emergency pumps kicked in, then lost pressure. Valves that needed power or intact control signals jammed under heat. Within moments, the refinery's firefighting grid wasn't overwhelmed, it was gone. By 7 a.m., Kirishi was no longer operating as a coherent facility. It had become an interconnected chain of failures, each explosion creating the conditions for the next. Flames rose into vertical towers, some climbing high enough to radiate heat like a furnace wall. That radiant heat spilled onto neighboring storage tanks, each holding tens of thousands of barrels, until seals failed and vapor layers ignited one after another. The western section of the refinery turned into a storm of fuel-fed detonations. Then the catalytic cracking sector, the heart of the plant, took its hit from shockwave and pressure shifts. Riser lines ruptured, superheated catalyst slurry spilled out, meeting leaking hydrocarbons in the open. The result wasn't just fire, it was a violent expanding pressure front that punched through heat exchangers and tore into pipe racks carrying diesel, naphtha, and other products across the site. Inside the control structures, screens went dark in sequence. Sensors reported impossible temperatures, then stopped reporting at all. From above, the scale of collapse became unmistakable, a plume stretching for kilometers, drifting toward the Baltic winds. And Russia's containment options were now mathematically limited, because without water pressure, you can't control a refinery fire. You can only watch it spread. By 7:30 a.m., the refinery that had supplied over 6% of Russia's refined fuel capacity was no longer functioning in any meaningful sense. What remained was a burning labyrinth, pipes acting like arteries that conducted heat deeper into the facility, feeding secondary fires and keeping entire sectors inaccessible. Emergency crews struggled to approach. Temperatures in key zones swung between extreme highs, hot enough to deform structural steel and turn aluminum fixtures into liquid. Surveillance observed hundreds of separate fire pockets, each fed by different broken lines still venting hydrocarbons. The shock hit Moscow fast. Kirishi's loss didn't just remove output, it locked away stored product across connected tank farms and disrupted regional pipeline pressures feeding major hubs. Analysts projected that even an accelerated recovery would take months just to restore partial operation. Full restoration, especially of complex units like the catalytic cracker and distillation train, could stretch toward a year, depending on parts, transport, and the reality of sanctions. But the deepest damage wasn't only industrial, it was doctrinal. For years, Russian air defense doctrine was built around the idea of layered certainty, long-range radars to see threats early, expensive interceptors to kill them at distance, fighters to clean up what slipped through. It was a network designed to stop bombers, cruise missiles, and high-end Western munitions. Kirishi exposed a different truth. That entire architecture, worth billions, was outmaneuvered by drones built from simple engines, commercial navigation components, and airframes cheap enough to lose in batches. Russia spent interceptor money on targets that were never meant to survive. Fighters chased what was easy to detect, not what was dangerous. And a sophisticated radar system, immune to jamming, was defeated not by noise, but by timing. The asymmetry was brutal. A refinery worth billions, providing fuel for logistics and regional hubs, reduced to chaos by aircraft no heavier than a suitcase. And as the smoke drifted over the Baltic, the real question stopped being what was destroyed. It became what comes next. Because if drones this small can tear open the armor of a refinery like Kirishi, then every critical facility inside UAV range, fuel, power, ports, factories, has to be rethought. So if you were the commander responsible for defending a site like this, what would you change tomorrow?